Hello, my name is Karoline Lewis, and I am the Marbury E. Anderson Chair in Biblical Preaching at Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. And this presentation is a supplement in addition to thinking about the sermon form, which I have called on your screen, as you see, the sermon form mapping a journey. And so there are a number of different kinds of forms that we can use in our preaching. What I want to do in this presentation is connect the sermon form with the other key elements of the sermon. How does the form relate to our central components or building blocks of a faithful sermon? And so when we think about the sermon brief, we think about really how do we summarize what a sermon is? We have what is the main focus of the sermon or the core affirmation or the theme or the subject? How can you summarize that in one sentence? And so the focus becomes also important for thinking about what the form is. What do I want to say about the focus are your moves. As David Buttrick talks about, you have different moves in the sermon, and these moves are in a way supporting your focus. So then what is the form? That's going to be the order. How do I begin and proceed through the moves and then conclude? And so those moves then are really the journey through the sermon. You want to think about, of course, the beginning of the sermon, how you're catching attention of your listener. What is that opening move? How does it set the tone for the sermon? Then you might have maybe 3 or 4 moves, but then think about your concluding move. What do you want to leave people with? What do you want them to remember? What is going to resonate or reverberate in their hearts? And so that closing move then ends up being really important. And then another building block of the sermon is what kind of effect do I want my sermon to have? What is the function of a sermon? What do you want your sermon to do? And the form really does connect with that function as well as support the focus. And so another way to think about this is the focus is the what of your sermon, what you want it to say. How would you summarize that main point or that core affirmation? The function is the why of a sermon. What do you want your sermon to do? What kind of effect do you want to have it have on your listeners? And then the form is the how of the sermon. How are you going to communicate the what and the why? So that's another way to think about the role of the form in a sermon. So a form is essentially an outline, right? It is really mapping out your plan from the opening and to the closing. And one of the ways to think about mapping this journey is once you have those individual moves, you might decide that you want one move in a different place. And so the moves are really helpful because one move might have a better effect, if you will, in a different part of the sermon. And so when you have those individual moves, then you can move them around depending on what kind of journey you want to lead people on. A couple of other things to remember in all of this is that the form means the way parts are put together, how you will organize your thinking. Ask what structure will work best for this sermon. That's a key thing. And so what I want this sermon to do, how will I enact the claim of this text? And the claim you make has an impact on how you will say it and organize it. So that's another sort of way of thinking about the role of the form or the importance of the form. The form, as you see in this very confusing sign, is really critical because people are following you or trying to follow you. So it's like way before GPS, we had to have people think about following us different places. And so you don't want them to end up with one of these signs, right? So a few other helpful hints. What did you discover in your exegetical study that you want to lead people to? How can you structure that discovery is another question you can ask a form. Label your moves in your manuscript. This is really helpful, and it also leads to potential memorizing of your sermon down the road, where you can block out your sermon and know what your next move is going to be. Ask yourself, can you remember the moves? Because if you can't remember the moves, then likely your listeners are not following you very well. And to remember that listening is really hard work. It is really hard to hear and to listen. And so, how is it that you can facilitate that listening? It's important to remember that in public speaking, the 65-40-10% rule, that while you are actually talking, only 65% of what you say is actually being digested by your listener. After an hour, that's 40%, and after 3 days, it's 10. So how can you increase those percentages? And then mix it up. What form will work best for this sermon? You don't want to always have the same form, because then you get predictable and you're not necessarily letting the text determine what you want your form to be. And so that becomes another important aspect of the form, is clues from the biblical text. What does the biblical text, what kind of clues does it give you with regard to the sermon form? And so, for example, the form that we have in Amos is that you have these first 2 chapters of judgment of Israel's neighbors before, in the middle of chapter 2, you have judgment for Israel. And so the effect of that form is essentially that the Israelites are on board with Amos, right? Woe to you, O Moab, woe to you, O Edom. And they're like, go Amos, go Amos, go Amos. But then when Amos says, and woe to you, O Israelites, that shock of that delayed address is also underscoring then the situation that Amos is trying to communicate and the importance of that situation. So the form then underscores a theological urgency. This is also then the case for when we see some of our great orators in the last century, particularly where you have Martin Luther King Jr., his "I Have a Dream" speech. Toward the end of that speech, he says, "Let freedom ring, let freedom ring, let freedom ring." And so he starts out, he really is using the form of Amos here, because he starts out by talking about freedom in the Alleghenies of Pennsylvania, in the hilltops of New Hampshire, in the Rockies of Colorado, and in the curvaceous slopes of California. So he is referring to all of these mountaintops or these mountains throughout the country. And so the listeners are all on board then with freedom in those places. But then Martin Luther King Jr. knows exactly where he's going. And then he says, not only that, but let freedom ring on Stone Mountain of Georgia. And Stone Mountain, Georgia, is a relief, as you can see in the slide, of 3 major figures of the Confederacy: Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee, and Jefferson Davis. And it really is a memorial to the Confederacy. And so Martin Luther King Jr. then knows exactly where he's going. And so once again, the listeners are, oh, we're fine with freedom all over the country, except for the South. And that's the effect. And so when we get to, when we hear not only that, let freedom ring in Stone Mountain of Georgia, the effect of that form really emphasizes his point of freedom needs to ring out from the mountaintops in Georgia in the South. We see a similar pattern in Paul's letter to the Galatians. Paul has used the form of the Greco-Roman letter in his other letters to the Philippians and the Corinthians and so on, and the Thessalonians. And that form of the letter is a salutation or a greeting. You have the body of the letter, and then you have a conclusion, or in his case, often a benediction. Well, Paul alters this form by adding a thanksgiving to this form. So he starts out with the salutation. He and then includes a thanksgiving for the ways in which the audience or the congregation has lived out the promises of the gospel, that the way in which they're living in Christian community. He gives thanks for them. And then he goes into the body of the letter. Well, Galatians is the only letter that does not include a thanksgiving. And so one of the reasons for that is that same effect. So the issue, of course, with the Galatian community is that some missionaries have come in and have said to the Galatians, yes, you are a member of the body of Christ. But what would really guarantee that, what would make sure, what would be the absolute certainty of that being a part of the body of Christ is circumcision. And so in doing that, what they have done is replaced the death and resurrection of Jesus with something that we do. And Paul will have none of that. And so I'm quite sure that Paul wrote some other letters to the community of Galatia. We just don't happen to have them in our New Testament. So this is not the only letter that the Galatians received from Paul. So they get this letter, they gather around because it's an oral experience. There's no including the letter in the newsletter, in the church newsletter. They gather around to listen to this letter. They know how Paul's letters go. Paul will start with the salutation. He will thank them for the ways in which they are living out the gospel, and then go into what his issues are, why he's sending this letter. Well, imagine the Galatians' shock and surprise and like, oh, when Paul says, you foolish Galatians, skips the Thanksgiving altogether and goes immediately to that rebuke. Well, that form then is emphasizing or underscoring the seriousness of the theological situation. In our contemporary case, the way in which Galatianism happens in our churches all the time. But for the Galatians, that they have substituted, they have replaced the death and resurrection of Jesus with something that they do, in this case, circumcision. And so Paul alters that form to underscore that seriousness. That's what form can do. Form has an effect. And so when we think about sermon form in our preaching, we're imagining what kind of effect do we want that form to have? And does it match the biblical text and the tone of the sermon? A couple of other directions we might take then for thinking about sermon form and thinking about the clues that we get in a biblical text are just paying attention to the narrative of the text, the narrative features of the text, which is a little bit different than form, but not necessarily, in that, is there a particular form of the text that we want to pay attention to? So, for example, John 4, 1 through 42, the story of Jesus' encounter with the woman at the well, it is a conversation. It's not a monologue, it's a conversation where they go back and forth in their dialogue. She asks questions, there are answers, as Jesus moves her along in a deeper understanding or realization of who he is. And so how does our sermon then model that, or think about the way in which a sermon might be more conversational, or a sermon might really pay attention to that dialogue that is present in the text? Another example is John 13 through 17, where you have 5 chapters dedicated to one night. in Jesus' ministry. So in John 1 through 12 has been 3 years of Jesus' ministry. 13 through 17 is the last night that Jesus spends with his disciples, where he is saying farewell, right? He is leaving them. And so time stands still, really. And you have 5 entire chapters dedicated to the reality of the troubled hearts and the concerns and the fear of the disciples. So a sermon on the farewell discourse will pay attention to that narrative space and how a sermon might be formed, put together, that honors and pays attention to that narrative space. So there is so much that you can do with sermon form, really taking our clues from the biblical text, paying attention to the form that is present. Does our sermon match the form of the biblical text? And really remembering that form is never benign. It is always something that is communicating that what of the form is communicating as much as the message, and oftentimes is really communicating that function.